Hi, how is everyone? Good? Can you all hear me? I feel like I'm shouting into this microphone. I would best describe this as a massive wardrobe fail as a Jayhawk to show up in Columbia wearing gold and black. But the good news is I have been here almost an hour and I have not yet burst into flames. So you can survive as a Jayhawk in Columbia. Anyway, like Adam said, I teach at Shawnee Mission West High School in Overland Park, Kansas. There are 5 Shawnee Mission schools, and we're all named super creatively with Shawnee Mission and then a direction. So chances are you've probably heard of one of us at some point and get us all confused, and that's fine. But right now I advise the newspaper, the yearbook, and I co-advise the website. In the time that I've been there, I've advised the literary magazine and sponsored the prom and taught English and broadcasting and a horrible class called individual tutoring that I hope I never have to do again, and all kinds of things. But right now I'm all journalism and consider myself really lucky to be that way. So we're going to talk about some design basics, and I threw in a little bit of everything. So there's some newspaper, there's some magazine examples. All of this applies to newspaper, to yearbook, to website. All the principles will apply across the board. So whatever you advise, hopefully there's something here for you. I don't think so, but I gave it to Adam this morning, and so he was going to put it online.
Yes, all of the material that she's going to present on is available online at asnemissourian.com/resources.
And if you'd like a copy of it after, I'll be happy to copy it onto your flash drive or something for you. Okay, so we're just going to dive right in. That's not what we're going to do. That would be wrong. Weird. Okay, so basically when we start designing, there's some design rules you need to know. We're going to go over some basic principles. And I would suggest that you and your students follow design rules most of the time. However, if you have a good reason for breaking one, then break it. Because if what you're doing works, then you don't want to get bogged down on if it's technically following one of the design rules, because they're kind of, design's a little bit all over the place now. So that's my disclaimer. If I'm going to tell you what the rules are, but if you feel like you need to break them sometimes, then do it. Okay, the most important thing you can remember about design is that form follows function. There has to be a reason for everything you're putting on the page. If you're just decorating, or if students are decorating, I would suggest to them that they go home and do a scrapbook, because that's a nice outlet for that sort of energy. But if it's going to be on a journalistic page, there needs to be a reason for it. Less is almost always better in design. And then you also need to remember, good design, you can design something all day long, but if the story's bad and the photos are bad, a pretty design is not going to fix it. It's not going to be any better. My good friend Kim Green from Indiana has a famous quote that she says, you can't make chicken salad out of chicken crap. I prefer to say poop in my classroom, but she's right. If you can take the best story and make it a horrible design, people won't, it's still a good story, but if you've got nothing to work with at the start, so content is still king, and that's important to remember. I know my students sometimes get really caught up in how things look, and they need to step back and think what you're trying to say is really the most important thing, because it can look pretty, but if it doesn't say anything, then it's sort of like Keanu Reeves, who I think is pretty to look at, but I don't really want to have a conversation with him. Okay. You need to create a personality for your publication, and you do that by establishing something through design. It used to be there'd be like one big trend in design, like it was like really clean and a lot of white space and that kind of stuff for a while, and then we got back into this kind of 90s grunge look, and now there's sort of two different, you could go grungy, you could go clean, and it's all popular right now, so you need to pick one, because you can't do both. But most of all, you want to design pages that kids are going to read. And I think we spend a lot of time trying to make our publications into professional newspapers. Well, I don't know about your students, but none of my kids sit down and read the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. I would love it if they did, but they don't. So our audience is high school students, so we need to make something that looks like something a high school kid would want to read. So at the end of the day, you and your students need to remember that teenagers make up your audience. So it needs to appeal to them visually and verbally. Okay, your nameplate of your paper or the cover of your yearbook is going to set the tone. That's where you're establishing your personality. This is a high school newspaper, and they are setting a tone for their publication right here. It's a really basic serif font, but they do play up the spoke part of it with the spokes in the O there, and the teasers, but it sets a really nice tone. It's very professional looking, it's very clean looking. The inside of their paper is much the same way. It wouldn't really work if they all of a sudden switched up the fonts on the inside and started using all kinds of different stuff and a whole different look. But because they've stuck with the personality they've created for their paper, it really works. You can also set a personality tone within a story. This is from a school in my district from one of their newspaper pages, and they did a five-page series about high school relationships. And this really creates personality, and it also looks like something that kids would want to read. Here's the inside. One thing that we're going to talk a lot about today is giving the reader multiple entry points. There's lots of different places that they could start and lots of different things that they could read. Teenagers have short attention spans. I don't know if you noticed that at all, but you may have. And so, you know, instead of like forcing a long story down their throats and insisting, yes, you will read this because it's good for you, why not give it to them how they want it? Now, that doesn't mean the whole world has to look like a text message or a tweet, because that would be bad. But you can certainly break up, there's a lot of content here. But it's designed in a very attractive way. It creates a lot of personality. It's really fitting for the story. Because what they're really doing is telling a story. And I know that in some of the other sessions you've been in, the emphasis has been on storytelling. And your design should enhance that and find different ways to tell the story and also appeal to different kind of readers. That's one of the other things we're going to talk about this hour, is getting some more of those infographics to kind of tease some of those non-readers into reading a little bit, or tricking them. Okay, this to me captures the mood of a story. It creates a really strong design personality. It's a tabloid-sized news page, but it looks like something a teenager would look at. This was about, what do you want in life? And then they've got the kid with all the different Post-its coming out of his brain, and it's in a handwriting font. And again, there's still a lot of content here, but it's packaged in a way that it's going to be appealing to those kids. By the way, all of these, or most of these, high school newspapers, I pulled off of Issue, ISSUU, because everything on the internet's spelled wrong, .com, and you can, if you search for high school newspapers on there, if you know the name of a few of them, you can look on there and you can find them. Okay, you also can be creative with visuals. I know a lot of times we'll get stories that, this one is about college choices, and it's kind of hard to come up with a visual for that. I don't know how many times I've seen, even my own students do, a picture of a kid staring at college brochures. Which I don't know that they ever actually do that. More likely it would be a pile of college brochures in the trash or the recycling bin, because they look at everything online. But this was a really creative way, I thought, to visually portray that. This whiteboard that they've got all their different choices written out, and again, it's very appealing to readers. Another example that they just had some fun with the graphics, and we need to remember it's okay to have some fun in our high school publications, because we want the teenagers to have some fun every now and then. This was from another school in my district, and they did a freshman issue. We have the first day of school for high school students in our district is for freshmen only. And so several of us do a freshman survival guide that we hand out to those kids, and this was one of their pages from that, which I thought was kind of fun. And instead of just making a bulleted list, they put it on a locker with Post-it notes. So, kind of cool. Okay, when we sit down to design, you need to establish structure. I would promise you that all of the examples that are on here have a column or grid structure behind them. I put this one up there because it's real easy to see the columns. This is there's 4 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4. You always want to keep the gutter between the columns empty. Unless, of course, you have something that takes up 2 columns, and then that space is not empty. But everything has to be a full column width. You can't have something be a half width. If this picture ended right here, you'd have all this weird, awkward space right here to deal with. And if you tried to run the story, it'd be too narrow, and it just wouldn't work. So everything has to be a full column width. What this is going to do is it's going to create some structure on your page. Now, will the reader ever know it's there? No. But that's okay, because they don't need to. It makes me crazy when my kids are working on something and I walk by and look at it and I'll say, hey, turn on your grids, and they're like, what? grid. Here's what it looks like. If you're using InDesign, this is just a blank tabloid size or 11 by 17 document, and I set it to be 11 columns. You can change that to whatever you want, but I would suggest your templates have that column grid, whatever your editors have decided is going to be for every page, because you want it to be consistent throughout. If you want to be really tricky, you can show the document grid, and that gives you some horizontal lines to go with your vertical lines there, which just looks like it's more confining, but to me it gives you that much more freedom to make things the size that they need to be, and it's going to look really, really sharp and polished when you're finished. And you know, they can turn off the snap too, so it doesn't actually have to snap to the line every single time. But this is going to allow you to be really precise. So that's one of the things when kids sit down to design, I would always suggest that you go by and make sure that they've got some sort of a column structure or some sort of a grid on there. Typically, if you're using narrow columns, you're going to want an uneven number, because if you're using an even number, things start to look symmetrical. Which is nice on butterflies, but not necessarily in newspaper or yearbook design. Okay, what are the things that a grid is going to do for you is going to create some consistent spacing. You can see there that these, and this is a design rule, that you want to keep your spacing consistent. There is one pica right here, there is one pica right here, there is one pica between all of these elements, and then there's the nice consistent external margins there. So it's a nice, clean, well-designed page, very basic. This is consistent spacing with a little bit smaller of it's not quite one pica, but again, it's all the same size between all of those elements, and so it gives us that nice polished look. And just to show you, design's a little bit all over the place now. This is some even smaller spacing. That's probably like maybe a hairline, but it's still consistent. And then just because I felt like being crazy, they didn't keep consistent spacing. This is from ESPN magazine, and look, their photos butt up against each other here, and then here they've got this tiny little hairline and a little bit more space right here, which works because they're ESPN designers and they know what they're doing. You know, if you're just looking at a spread and it's kind of all over the place, or a page, then the kids maybe didn't intend for it to happen that way. But just check and see. But so that's kind of a trend now. Or you could also, I don't think I went, nope, you could overlap, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so we've got our grid set up. Then the first thing that you put down on any kind of page when you're designing is the dominant element. And a lot of times kids will be like, that's crazy, you put the story first. No. You need to determine what's the dominant element on your page. If it's a traditional newspaper page and it has multiple elements, something's got to be bigger than everything else. And that's where the news judgment comes into play, because they got to figure out what gets the most weight, what's the most important and should get the biggest play. But something on that page, be it a yearbook, a magazine, a newspaper, or a website even, needs to be 2 to 3 times bigger than everything else, because that's going to give me a place to start. It's almost always a photo. It could be a headline package, or it could be a cluster of photos, and we'll look at some examples. And then you're going to build the other elements around that dominant photo. So the dominant photo is going to be the first thing you put down on your page. Here's an example of a high school newspaper with nice big dominant photo. Now, I would point out their dominant photo is a teaser for a story that's on the inside, but it's probably a fairly in-depth story and not just like a little news brief, because otherwise it wouldn't really work. A lot of professional publications will also do wild art, where it's just like a large photo with an extended caption, and that works too. Yes. This is the Harvard Westlake Chronicle. It is. It's really not fair. And you know, they've got multiple things, and you can also, since we're on here, this was dominance, but you can also see their grid here. There's 1, 2, 3, they've got 4 columns, and they're making it work. It doesn't look symmetrical. And we also didn't slap down that dominant photo right smack in the middle. You want it off to one side, at the top or at the bottom. You don't want it to be like right in the middle of your page. So this really, really works. This is the same paper, but this is an inside page, and just to show you, your inside pages need a dominant element too, even when you've got like multiple. This just has one story on it, but if you had multiple things going on, you'd still need to find a dominant to go there. If you don't have a dominant, you can create a dominant. Now, sometimes you may not have the photos to have a dominant photo, like your image quality may not be there, the content of the photo may not be there to make a photo really big, because, making a bad photo really big is not going to make it any better. It's like the chicken salad. So you can create a dominant out of a group of photos, like we did right here. Now, this photo is a little bit bigger than everything else, but it's not 2 to 3 times bigger, and it's the same size as these two grouped together, but we get that that top part is the dominant element. It gives us a place to start. Okay, this is a photo story, and I wanted to put it on there to show you that even a photo story needs to have a story, and it also needs to have a dominant element. Now, this one's a little bit funky because the photos are sort of, they crash together, which I'm not sure I love, but they did it anyway. So she's kind of cut out of this photo and goes into the next photo. But they did an okay job with it, because if she was like hitting that guy on the head or it was over a little bit more, it wouldn't really work. But because of where she is, it still sort of works. I don't know that I love it, but if you have a photo essay, you still need a dominant photo. You don't want to have everything all the same size. Yeah, and also what she's doing, one of the design techniques is you want to lead the reader around the page, and she definitely does that because she's the biggest thing. I'm drawn to her, and I look at the direction her hand's going, which leads me to these boys, and then he's looking down into the story. That's not really accidental.
My biggest pet peeve is when my kids have people looking away from the article
Right.
off the page. It's like it drives me bonkers, and they don't understand it. Like I have to explain to them over and over again about directing.
Right. They need to be looking, I should add that rule there. People need to be looking at what they go with. What you don't want to do, however, is just flip those images to make it go. And here's a fun little story about that. My first year at Shawnee Mission West, they had actually done this the spring before because it was in the spring supplement, but somebody came in and when school started and pointed out to me, we had a picture of this tennis player, and he was holding the racket, swinging the racket in his right hand, and somebody was like, does that look funny to you? And I was like, no. And then they were like, look closely, and I realized who it was, and the kid didn't have a right hand. His hand stopped at the wrist. He was left-handed. He was holding the racket in his left hand, and when we flipped it, we gave him a hand he did not have. We don't really have that right to be handing out appendages to people that they're not born with, and so it was embarrassing, because all the kids at our school knew, and they thought, and they always just kind of look a little funny too, even if it's not that dramatic. But the text is backwards, and things just look a little bit off when they're backwards. So if they've got stuff facing the wrong way, don't just flip it, even though it's really easy on a computer. My kids did it in the dark room. You can be impressed that I'm that old. So, yeah, you don't flip it, but she's very much leading us around the page, so that works. Now, just because I wanted to throw in some rule breakers, this is a magazine. There's no dominant element there, but it still looks pretty cool, doesn't it? I'd still read it. So, again, for every rule, there's an exception that you can make it work.
Wouldn't that fall through the gutter, though? Wouldn't the paint break sort of...
I think, yeah, well,
Or is that what you're saying?
yeah, there's a space between there. But some of the pictures go right through the gutter. This is from, can't remember what magazine this is. Can't read the little tiny text down there. But I just kind of, because it gives a bunch of stuff all the same size, so it just breaks every rule I just told you about, but it works. So, if you look at something and it looks good, go with it. Okay, you want to have balance on your pages. You don't want them to feel like they're going to topple over or, fall over backwards. And that's what you have to pay attention to all the sides, and that's where we want to have our white space to the outside of the page, because white space is the lightest element. Photos are going to be the heaviest. Text is gray, so it's kind of in between. And that's where we want to be. My kids always get all frustrated when I'm talking about, well, you've trapped that caption, and they're like, what does that mean? I'm like, look, it wants to get out. It's screaming, help me, and they think I'm crazy. But you need to plan for that, and this is where modular design comes into play, that you're balancing out your modules, and you have to plan for that. And this is the Kirkwood Call from Kirkwood, Missouri, just down the road a little bit. And this is their front page, and it's got a lot of different stuff on it. It's all designed in modules. They didn't have a dominant photo, but they made their main story into almost the whole page and a dominant piece of artwork for that story. And they balanced it because we've got a really heavy element here, and we're balancing it with the white and gray of this text down here, so it really balances out. And I don't know a better way to explain balance that otherwise, you don't want it to be like tipping over, and I always have to do that when I say it. Okay, this is a facing page of a high school magazine, news magazine, and they kept balance very much in mind. Now, although the whiter space is towards the middle, so again, it's kind of breaking one of those rules I told you about. But one thing that's really helping it is we've got these empty rails. They're using those small columns we looked at when we looked at the column structure. So that is an empty column. That's probably the size of their column grid right there, is that one empty column. And they've used it to isolate it, so it makes it okay for that heavy element to sit over there on the side, because it's balanced. Okay, typography. I don't know how many of your students like to sit down and Google all the free fonts that they can and put them on the computers, and then if you look at your page, it's like every font that was ever created is on one page. I like to call that a font circus, and we don't do that. You don't want to go crazy with fonts, and in fact, I have a whole speech about downloading fonts from the internet. Because you never really know what you're going to get. And some of them are set up to be just screen fonts. Some of them are set up to actually print. But if you're trying to print them in your newspaper or yearbook, you need to find out. And you also need to find out you can download it for free, but that doesn't mean that you can use it for something that you're going to print and distribute. You might be violating the terms of usage of that agreement. So you need to find out before you do that. And sometimes they just don't print right. Every once in a while I have a kid that is like just determined he's going to use a font that he downloaded, and so he'll make it into artwork in Photoshop, and if he's willing to go to that length to do it, then fine. But you still don't really ever want to have more than 3 fonts on a page. And you only want to use your specialty fonts for specialty packages. Otherwise, you want to stick with have a style guide where you establish this is going to be our headline font, this is our subhead font, this is our body copy font, and this is what we use. End of story. And then for special situations, you use your fancy fonts. This is a high school newspaper, and it's very nice, clean look. They've got a serif font and a sans serif. This is their sans serif headline font, and then they've got a serif font that complements it because they look nice together, they play well. It looks like it matches. You don't want to pick 2 serif fonts or 2 sans serif fonts because they're not going to probably be different enough, and they're going to fight for attention.
The font thing is another thing that drives me. And I want to know how to balance the advisor role of, I really want to tell you exactly how this should be, and then as editors, you need to understand what's right for you. And like we always have, our news people, our editorial, and our sports are usually really good about it. Feature and entertainment go, font circus all over the place. And I try to explain to them, I try to talk to them, I try to talk to the editors, and really ultimately the editors and chief's decision about what, and oftentimes it's the conflict that they want to avoid. So I guess what I'm asking is
how do you make that stop?
Yeah, not bumping heads. But just like what do you suggest, or how do you establish your style book at the beginning? Is it consistent throughout the years? Do you have a meeting at the beginning? Like what do you?
The editors determine the style book.
Does it change from year to year?
It does.
Significantly?
Not always. Sometimes they'll keep sort of the same look. Sometimes they'll do a massive overhaul. Last year we did a pretty big overhaul, and I think we're probably going to do another one. The same is true for Yearbook. Like they sit down and they pick what fonts they want to use, and then that's just what we use. And I came in at the end of Sue talking about editing and hands-on, and I very much agree with her. I am very hands-off as an advisor. I do not sit down at the computer. I do not fix things for them. I wince sometimes when I walk by. I wince sometimes when it's published. But it's their publication, and they're not going to learn if I fix it for them or if I force something down their throats. And so usually I found that the best thing that works with my kids is I'm just painfully honest with them when they ask me what I think of it. I'm like, well, that's really ugly. Do we have to change it? No, but it's really ugly. And every once in a while, they'll still do something, but most of the time, they'll change it. And sometimes it works really good, too, if you can plant, it works really well if you can plant the seed in someone's head, and then if you do a group critique, have them be like, hey, that's really ugly. Then they hear it from one of their peers, and then it's like, oh, maybe we should change.
What I found helpful is that a lot of fonts will come in a family.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll have a serif, a sans serif, an italic, a bold, a condensed, all within the same family. So that gives you some options and still some similarities used. And also what we'll do is turn make their headline, make it bold, make it as fat as we can, then turn that into a shape. Then you can fill it with something, either a texture or a photo. And that gives them some customization without actually picking a new funky font that doesn't match. So
Right.
that's something I found that helps a little bit with my yearbook.
So I think the key is just kind of training those editors to make good choices at the beginning. So, this is from Shawnee Mission Northwest in my school district, and they are making really good use of a font family here. They picked just a sans serif font, and it's one font for everything on that cover, but they've used all kinds of different weights and sizes, so it looks a little bit, it makes it look different. And it ends up with a really nice, sophisticated look, I think. Orange is their school color, so hence the orange. This is the inside where they've used some complementary type, and they've got the sans serif or the serif font up here, which is really bordering on being a display font. Like it's almost one of the fancy fonts because it's kind of big and got these big serifs, but it looks really nice. And again, it's a page with no artwork really. I mean, mugshots of the principal are not necessarily super exciting artwork, but they made this page look more interesting, and this is from their freshman guide, so it really is information that they wanted to convey to those kids, and they managed to do it in a graphically interesting way using the typography. And so I think, like you said, you can use the weights of the different weights. They also used shades of gray. There's no color here, but they just used different shades of gray to make it look more interesting. So it works. This is from a high school news magazine, and again, this is their headline, and they use all the different font families here for their, for this whole magazine spread, and it looks really, really nice. This is a specialty font. This is from the Northwest Passage again, and they did this big story about why sleep matters, and this was it was 3 pages, so this was the first page, was just the headline and the subhead leading us into the story. And we're not going to look at the rest of the story yet. It's somewhere later. Here's the other one. And you want to make sure they fit the tone of the story every once in a while. And yearbook kids are kind of worse about this. You'll get a yearbook or something that has like a scripty, flowery font on the sports pages. And it just looks weird. And so I like to classify the fonts too in my classroom. Just let my students know, like, these would be good copy fonts. These would be good caption fonts. These would be good for display headlines. These would only be good for wedding invitations. And so that way they know, like some of the ones that are more hands-off that we kind of avoid. Okay, color is another issue. And we're going to talk color in black and white. I don't know how many of you are using a lot of color in your publications. I know we finally have like 12 pages of color when we switched to being on newsprint because the paper was cheaper, so we could afford more color. When InDesign first came out, people were, it literally, and all-color yearbooks were terrible about this. The first few all-color yearbooks, it literally looked like a clown had thrown up on the page. Like, seriously, every color under the rainbow. After we got finished with the font circus, we moved on to the color circus. And it was crazy. That does not make good design. This is a newspaper page, and it's really, really nice. They were inspired by the colors in that photo. They took the picture of the kid. It's a kid who's dancing professionally, and they got this great photo of him with these trees, and they used the inspiration from that photo to determine the color on the rest of the page. And it's very, very nice. And I don't love the QR code there on the picture, but That's partly because I don't really understand those, and I've never used one. And every once in a while, one will pop up on the back page of our newspaper. The kids will do one, and I'm like, where are you linking that to? Because I don't know. They link it back to our website, but here's the inside of that sleep page, where again, there are no photographs on this page, which again would be a huge design rule that we're breaking, but they found a way to make it visually appealing, and they're using the color family they're using here are these very cool colors, which really work with the sleep subject. If we'd used reds and pinks and oranges, no. But they use those nice, cool, soothing colors to create that. And again, tons of entry points, lots of different stuff that's going to appeal to non-readers here that's hopefully going to get them into the story. And then there still is a sizable story there. So you can tell longer stories. You just got to trick them into reading it with the other stuff. Okay, you can also use color as a tool to lead the reader around the page. Here we picked up on the red from his uniform and his shoes and the soccer ball, and they used it to draw us to the Q&A and change the questions in black, his name's in red. So it's just a nice, subtle use of color. There's more color on that page than the other ones that we've been looking at, but because they just focused on the red with their text, it makes it look nice and harmonious. Here's one that's gray, just to show you that black and white can be interesting too. And we looked at a couple of the other examples too of some of the stuff that was black and white that looked really cool. So just because if you don't have color, you don't have to think that your book or your newspaper has to look boring, because it's up to you to design it well. And again, another example, they didn't really have candid photos to go with, so they created a nice dominant photo to go with that story. It's about wisdom teeth and having your wisdom teeth pulled, which is actually a really great story idea now that I have said that out loud, because a lot of kids get their wisdom teeth pulled. So we've never done a story on that, but I'm going to remember it now. Okay, alternative coverage works. It just seems like it goes hand in hand into design. So I've put in some examples of different ways schools are using it, because we do live in a really visual society, and you've got to appeal to those people. You know, we can't keep telling them, no, you must read really long blocks of text, because they don't want to. And if they don't want to, they're going to put your paper or your book down, or they're going to log off your website, and they're not going to read it. And so you're defeating your purpose right from the get-go. So you've got to make it visually appealing to your audience. They are a little bit easier to read. They offer more entry points. It's a great way to deal with numbers and statistics that kind of get a little bit tedious in writing. And just like we talked about, if you're following the rules, great. If you need to break a rule, break one. The same thing works here. You need to determine the best format to tell the story. And if the best format to tell the story is a long-form story, then by all means. I've read many times Sarah's Hope, the story that Sue referenced, and Eric Adler is right down the road from us at KU, so yay, we love getting to have him come talk to our kids. It's a beautiful story. It would not work in a chart. It had to be a narrative form. So you've got to figure out what makes it work. When we looked at that sleep spread back there, that wouldn't have worked as well and with all those numbers and all that stuff going on, but it worked as in alternative coverage. So you got to find the best way to tell the story. And then you have to find a way to make them interesting. I've always harped on my kids, no pie charts, they're boring, no bar graphs. And then I found some of these publications that were doing really cool stuff with pie charts. This was about the racial diversity in colleges, and they made a pie chart and they used different colors of M&Ms to make up the difference.
Non-resident alien color.
That's true. And there's one little red one for American Indian. But it also makes a really nice visual, dominant element over there, and then it's just really kind of a cool graphic. And I never would have thought of it. Numbers are just natural for quick reads. We've got the box down here by the side. Good information for people to know. There's another one right there in the middle that gives us some statistics so that, we'll read all this and then it'll attract us into the story. One thing that kids have to remember, it's still journalism. You still have to research, it still has to be accurate, it still has to be thorough. One thing I thought, this was a really cool looking graphic. They don't tell me anywhere how many kids were surveyed, which we would need to know to make those statistics valid. Like how many kids were surveyed and where, and were they all at your school? So you do need to provide some information like that, because you know, if they only asked 2 kids how many hours of music they listen to every day, well, there you go. But you know, you need to look up and see for your school size, how many kids do you have to survey to make it a valid statistical base. So still journalism, and you still have to attribute your sources. This one down here, you can't read it, but this is the attribution of where they got the statistics. So they didn't steal this whole chart, but they looked up the statistics and they made the chart based on it. So you still have to generate the content yourselves. It still has to be good journalism. You don't want to use it to fill space because the story is too short. You want to plan it ahead of time, and that should be a collaborative effort of all the people working on that page. So it doesn't just fill space that somebody left because we didn't have a picture or because the story was too short. I thought this was a really cool, this is a full page that they did, and you know, if you read magazines at all, lots of magazines have just like a numbers page like this now. Airplane magazines are really big into that. And I think the Southwest Spirit always has one towards the back, and I always read it. So think about what you read. Why not do it at your school? So really, theme was about pop culture there. So really cool though. Here is a different option about jackets and coats and what you're going to wear this winter, which again, that's something that kids worry about. That's what they want to know. So you should give them what they want to know. And you could use this in lots of different ways. That if you had little mini profiles about a group of kids, this would be kind of a fun way to do it, instead of just like a block of text with a mugshot photo. Like, this is just a little bit more interesting. I will say one of my pet peeves design-wise is when we cut out the background for no apparent reason. And we just have people floating about. They're anchored here on that platform, so it doesn't, otherwise I picture like astronauts in space. And floating heads are the worst, when you just have the person's head and it's floating around on the page and for no good reason. It makes me crazy. Scatter stories are something that a lot of magazines are doing, so why not do it in your paper? And again, this is a high school paper, this is their entertainment page. And so, you're probably not going to write an entire story about kids liking the French vanilla cappuccino from Phillips 66. But it's enough for a little chunk there. And they cut that out and it works. But so it's just kind of a cool design. And you can see the grid if you're looking. There's a grid on there. This is the entertainment page. It works really well for that because a lot of those reviews aren't going to be super long and you don't really want them to be. There's nothing worse to me than when I get a big music snob on my paper that wants to like agonize and beat to death song lyrics and tell me what it means and tell me why it's better than, like, I would rather stick pins in my eyes than read that. So this is a nice way to get and also you can appeal to lots of different kinds of musical taste, movies and stuff like that if you use little scatter stories.
On your paper, how often do you keep, or I guess your editors, how often do the editors keep on sort of static layout? Like, for example, their opinions page or something, like, is there always a column in one spot, or how often do you keep the same layout? Do you always have to change it?
I would say we have at least one opinion page that's always the same. It has the editorial board, a cartoon, and the staff box. There's not a lot of change on that. We have one entertainment page that was pretty much a template that they just kind of plugged in stuff, and then we had one sports page that was that way. But everything else was a little bit more flexible. So feature pages change every time. Most of the sports pages changed. Ours is usually between 24 and 36, depending on what's going on. And we just switched to monthly. We used to be every 2 weeks, but when we added the website, we went to monthly. So right about 2,000 kids. Okay, so I picked out some trends from school papers and from magazines that I just thought were kind of fun to look at because I think it's always nice to see what's out there. And you can look for design ideas everywhere. I'm the person that's always like tearing something out of a magazine or stopping and taking a picture of something because I think it looks cool. And then I'm harassing my kids with it, like, look how cool this looks. And every once in a while they take me up on it and use something. Magazines, advertising, websites, all over. Advertising is a great resource because, you know, they're trying to get your attention too, which is what we're trying to do. So you can certainly be inspired by them. I listed just some of my favorite magazines, and I discovered this summer the Zinio app on my iPad, which allows you to browse some free content. You can purchase subscriptions to magazines or purchase individual magazines on there too, but you can also browse the free content of featured magazines, and so there were some that I would never ever look at that because it was free on Zinio, I just started glancing through it and I found some really kind of cool stuff. So yearbooks have kind of been doing this for a long time, but newspapers are a little bit slower to kind of catch on board, but you can adapt anything from a magazine even to work in, you know, even if you have a broadsheet, you could use elements from that thing. This is from a high school newspaper. It's dangerously scrapbooky to me, but you know, the kids, they love the Polaroids, which is funny because I don't think any of them probably remember a Polaroid camera, but they love making things look like a Polaroid. So, you know, it's kind of cool. It's a little bit scrapbooky, but gets a lot of different kids on the page. That's nice. Really big headlines are something that we're seeing a lot of. This is from a high school newspaper, and they're taking up one whole page with that headline. That they, again, and there's no visual here, or no photo, but they've used that visual of the earphones there to get our attention. Headlines on top of photos. We're seeing this all over the place. And a lot of really pure photographers will tell you that this see things on top of their pictures. They don't want you to mess with their photos. It's the same way writers feel about when somebody starts editing it, like we don't mess with it. But it's all over the place, and you have to be really careful. They placed this really well. You know, we don't want to put things on top of his head. We don't want to make it so we can't see it. If it were, these words were over here on the shelf where there's a little bit more stuff, it would be hard to read. So they placed it really, really well. And again, they picked up on the color from that, the red in the desk there, and used it, so it looks really nice. Incorporating the photo into the headline. So we've got the lending a hand, so a really strong visual verbal connection there. Looks really cool. Okay, this is from a magazine, and putting the text on top of the photos, you can see, so this whole spread is essentially a photo. Now, if you're going to make a photo that big, you got to make sure you have a really good photo. And you also have to make sure that you've got space that we can read. It works because the story is on top of the sky and it's really readable. If you can't read it, then again, you're kind of just shooting yourself in the foot, because if we can't read what we're writing, then what's the point? Here's a high school example of doing that same thing. Well, they didn't put the whole story on it, but we've got this really big picture. And he's facing off the page, which we previously discussed as a big pet peeve, but if you read it, catch him if you can, and then in parentheses they put you can't, because he's running away from us. So the visual and the verbal match, so I suddenly don't care that he's running off the page. And also, I think it's really clever, and I think it's funny, and I think too often we forget to use that sense of humor when it's appropriate in our publications. But catch him if you can. You can't. You're not going to catch that kid.
It also uses the same layout as the movie. Catch Me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I hadn't even thought about that. This is from a magazine, and talk about inconsistent spacing. They've got the photos overlapped here, which again works because we're not interrupting the action of the photo. They've isolated some of the photos with white space, and then put our text in a block down there. But it's kind of a combination of different kinds of looks, but I like it. This is from another school in my district, and they came up with famous kids that had gone to their school and made a whole page about it. And then they took it a step further, which this is a nice level of storytelling, that they found other famous people from Shawnee Mission from the other schools in the district, which I thought was kind of a nice touch. pretty much our big claim to fame right now is that Paul Rudd and Jason Sudeikis went to my school. And so the kids are really, because they're kind of popular right now, so they're all excited about that. But they found all these different stories to tell about kids that were doing, graduates that were doing cool stuff, and did little scatter stories. Okay, here's one about college choices, and they made a roadmap instead of just telling us a story or a step-by-step thing. So it's a little bit visually more interesting. This is from Esquire, and in addition to being well-designed, this particular story was really funny. It was about fatherhood. And so, but I liked that they used, almost like these became little icons that told us where to read, and then I liked the suggested reading, because I have a 3-year-old and we have read all of those in the last 3 days. So they're right, too. And then, they've got this this continued all throughout the entire story. It was like a several-page series, but it was a really nice design, I thought. This is from Field and Stream. I don't really read Field and Stream, but I looked at it on my Zinio app. And the idea of using illustrations when you don't have photographs works. If you can find a good cartoonist or a good artist at your school, you should drag them into your classroom and not ever let them leave. And if they try to graduate, you just fail them until because those kids are really hard to find, but when you get a good one, it is so worth it. We have one right now. He's going to be a senior this year, and I don't know what we're going to do when Garrett leaves, because I don't know how many times kids will be like, hey, Garrett, can you draw? And he'll just sit down for a few minutes and come up with it. So, but that was just a really cool layout, I thought. This is from another magazine, and again, it's this the worlds are colliding, that we've got this nice clean design and then we're grunging it up with the vines here, but it really works for this particular story. There's one of the inside pages there. And yeah, this borders on decorating a little bit, but they used it so sparingly that it didn't really start to get annoying, but they really created a nice look for that particular story. Okay, this is from Bloomberg, which again, I don't really read, but I found it on Zinio. And this was before Facebook went public earlier this summer, and breaks all kinds of design rules, because we've got the story right there, or the headline right on his head, his face. If he moved it just a little bit, that K would be poking him in the eye. But it's not, so it's okay. And it's about hacking. It says how Zuck hacked the valley, so we've got a real hacky looking font there. Here's the inside, which I don't know that I love it, but I think it works. It's not something that I would normally say stay away from circles, but they've got this whole page graphic about all the different people in his social world there. And look, they're floating heads. Here's the next page, which this is just funny now. Who gets rich? No one. When it went public, but that's what again, they use the color sparingly. It's not all over the place. We've got some more floating heads down here, which it looks like that's about to hit her in the head, but just kind of something different I thought I'd throw in there. Some resources for you to look at. The Newspaper Designer's Handbook, which is by Tim Harrower. You can get that in the JEA bookstore. If you don't have one, you definitely need one, because it's the best book ever. I still have the one I had to buy in college as a textbook for my class, and now there's like 6 more since then. You can also look at the Best of the High School Press from the National Scholastic Press Association. CSPA releases a CD of their crown winners. It's a DVD probably actually, that you can look at different high school examples. The Pantone website is kind of fun to play on if you're looking for different examples of using color, and they also sell lots of different resources and books about using color well. The JEA bookstore, just kind of look for the design books, the issue.com, and then just really all around you, because there's all kinds of places to be inspired by design. And remember, you can break the rules if it works. But if it doesn't work, don't do it. Any questions? Your brain's going to explode?
What's your feeling about borders on photos? I noticed one of the scripts they had them.
When I first started, it was like a rule that you will put what did we even call it? Is it a frame? I don't know, you will, because now it's in InDesign it's a stroke, so we called it a frame when we used Quark Express, that you will put a border around all that, but we don't anymore, and I think it kind of, whatever style you adapt, you just want to be consistent. If you have really crisp photos, it works really well to not have that frame, but if you've got like kind of muddy photos that they need that, then you can use them.
What's a good place to go to begin instruction on designing some of the graphics?
I would look at the Newspaper Designer's Handbook. He's got a whole section about planning story packages that's really cool, and like an actual plan sheet that you can copy and use for your kids can sit down and use the plan sheet to walk through their story package. And then he's got just all kinds of examples of the different kinds of graphics you can incorporate. Like, I mean, a whole section of them, so it's a great place. And then also just look at magazines, because if you pick up any magazine, they're almost all going to be full of infographics now.
So teachers who can't afford InDesign or don't want to take time out to learn it, it's quite difficult. What other software do you recommend?
You know, that's a good, I taught at a yearbook workshop earlier this summer where I, for the first time, had seen their online production stuff. I don't know if you advise the yearbook or the newspaper, or what, but the yearbook companies are doing some really kind of cool stuff with online production that I thought it was just going to be like, here's a template, plug your stuff in, and it really wasn't. Like, you could actually design stuff. But I don't know of anything else. Microsoft Publisher? Yeah, I've never used it, so I don't know. But
Anything new with indexes? I've seen some schools that do new
wow.
What were your thoughts about
Well, for your yearbook, I think you definitely still need an index. And I'll tell you, we had some issues with our index this year, and it's true, everyone reads the index, because I heard more about, hey, the index was wrong. And I'm like, I know. But again, most of the yearbook companies have some pretty cool plugins that you can use to run your index, but you still got to go back through and hand check it, which was kind of where we fell apart. And you know, it also doesn't add in, you should be indexing the sports and the clubs and the spread topics, and that doesn't magically happen.
One more question. How do you address mistakes? Because they're inevitable, and so much work goes into it, and I heard some of the advisors sort of, you know, you feel so embarrassed, but how do you handle it if something makes it in? And
It's not an if, it's a when. You know, you just kind of have to smile and remind people, well, it's a student publication, and they're high school students, and they're not perfect, and we really try to use it as a learning experience. And you really have to do that then, too, is to come back to the kids and be like, you know, this is what didn't work, and here's why, and let's talk about it. I'm also a big believer in my editors handle a lot of those complaints. Like, and yearbook's hard because it happens at the end of the year, so they're gone, and you're left there like a bullseye. But I think it's important. We had the principal was all fired up about a story that was in my newspaper last year about synthetic marijuana kind of, and he had never heard of it. And so so we did the story about it, and he was like all just fit to be tied, and he said, I want to talk to you about this. And I said, okay, well, I'm bringing Alex, my editor, with me. And he said, why? And I said, he's the one that chose to run the story. And you know, I'm in Kansas, so we have a law protecting our students, so it's a little bit different. But even Alex was a little bit like, I don't want to go talk to the principal. And I'm like, if you're going to do the stories, you got to be able. So I just kind of emphasize to my students, if you want to make the decisions and be telling the stories, you have to be able to explain, this is why we did the story the way we did. And you can't just look at somebody and be like, because I can. That's not a good reason. So, but a lot of times you just smile and nod and thanks for the feedback, and we'll work on that next time. And
I invite them to be on the staff.
That's true too.
That's great that you caught that. We need more editors, people to catch those things. You should think about joining Yearbook.
I had a fellow teacher at my school who had a very active red pen, and she would mark up all kinds, and it wasn't just me, she did it to everybody, like flyers that would be posted in the hallway, she'd mark them up and shove it in somebody's mailbox, and she did it all anonymously, which annoyed me, but everybody knew who it was. And so, ironically, her daughter was the editor of the yearbook at another school in my district. And so it'd be like, is anybody doing that to her? She finally retired though, so we don't have to worry. But you know, it just comes with our job that you take a lot of flack that other teachers don't. I try to make myself scarce sometimes. I do what I like to call a preemptive strike on the day the paper comes out, and I take the paper myself through the office and hand it to everybody, and then I just disappear. So that way they've seen me with it in my hands. I've given it to the principal, I've given it to the principals, and then I... But my room's also, I have a basement classroom, so they really have to be looking for me to find me.
One more stupid question.
That's fine.
What's your philosophy about ads? So let's say you've been really trying very hard to have a certain flow for the book, and then someone buys an ad, and you think it's garish, but, you know, of course, they paid the money to put it in there, so...
They paid the money. And I fight with my kids about that because they always want all the ads to have a similar look and feel, and that's nice, but at the end of the day, that person paid for that space, and...
So you kind of see that you can just let loose there and sort of look at the ad section as a separate...
Well, in my head I can't, but I just do. And that's a lot of, you know, with design stuff, somebody asked, like, how do you not, you just can't control everything. You just have to kind of, like, a lot of times. And I have another advisor in my area that's a really good friend of mine, and we keep a running list of things called, that's not what I would have done. And that really helps a lot, too, that we have that. Like, I can email her and be like, hey, here's an example of not what I would have done.
When I send out my ad sales letters, you know, looking for people, I offer to have one of our students design an ad for them. You know, we like our students to. So that's one thing that I offer, and a lot of times I do get, you know, ridiculous looking, whatever. And yeah, you have to live with it. But I do offer letting our students design something as the first choice, and sometimes they take us up on that.
That's usually what happens for us.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, especially in Yearbook, you'll get a parent that, or a lot of the portrait studios now are designing ads as part of the senior picture packages. And so you get something that doesn't look like anything. But then, you know, you kind of look at it and be like, well, we didn't have to do anything with that. We just put it on the page and done. So why not? Yes?
One of the things I started doing a few years ago when I got tired of getting parent complaints about the yearbook is I took the colophon, which usually you put in the back of the book, and I put it on page 3 because I thought, well, magazines have their colophon in front. And so when you turn to, you know, first page, second, third, and on the third page, we have our big colophon, and it always starts off with who's the editor-in-chief, and so they can, and it says, the very first line says, this is a student-produced publication. Because I've had parents call and be all upset and want their money back and stuff, and I'll say, you know, would you go to a varsity football game and when you lose, go to take it off and ask for your money back? So this is a student-produced publication, but we only do 50% of the work. That's the other thing is we do all the work, then we send it into the printers, and then a lot of times, I mean, we're at the mercy of whatever can happen with the plan. So, yeah, I put the colophon in the front, and then I also include pertinent information like when were the senior pictures due, so that, you know, I get people to say, oh,
I didn't know.
and I put a description of what procedures we follow to get the senior pictures. And one of the things I do is we post the proof pages out in the hallway for people to come and check. And I still, 2 years ago, I had 2 kids whose pictures weren't in the book, and parents got all upset, and principal then asked me to get, I now have to get, my goal is to get every senior in the building to sign off that their picture is correct and spelled right and everything. We still had some problems. I turned in 3 pages that everybody was there when the book got published, 2 seniors' pictures that they skipped off pages. But I put all that information in that colophon at the very beginning so that I can refer people to that very quickly and just right up front, this is a student-produced.
I've also found if you have people that want their money back, you just say, well, I'd like the book back then. And then no one ever hands that book back over. So, and you know, you don't get to go into Target and buy something and want to return it and keep the money and the item. Like, it just doesn't work that way, so.
Well, thank you so much, Amy.
You're welcome.